Hello and welcome. Ed Davey has just concluded his speech to Liberal Democrat conference, and we are here with everything you need to know about what was in it and how the Lib Dems now see their opportunities. In about 20 minutes. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to a special debrief edition of Politics at Sam and Anne's. Our debriefs are unashamedly quick turnaround podcasts, so you know what to take away from big events. So hello from Bournemouth. You can hear in the background, we're less than an hour after this conference ended, and you can hear them packing up and de-rigging. There's a huge amount of equipment that needs to be ejected from the Bournemouth Conference Centre at a moment like this. Everyone can't wait to get home. True of all political party conferences, not just the Lib Dems, I must say, in the interests of balance. But we are less than an hour off the peroration of this conference where Ed Davey, as leader, gave a speech which I felt was all about vibes, specifically anti-Farage vibes. So there's a lot to chew on. By the way, Anne, just a question of vibes. I had to borrow a tie from Channel 4 News in order to do all my telly for this event. I'd actually assumed that Lib Dem conference was a tie-off rather than a tie-on event. Was I right, or am I missing something?
I suppose it depends whether you brought your sandals in the old joke about Lib Dems. But assuming that your footwear was on point, one good thing about being a woman covering these conferences, you might worry a bit about what you're going to wear, especially if you're going to be on the box like you. But tie on or off is not something that has really caused me much pause for thought. So I'm going to say you do you, Sam. You do you. And how nice of the colleagues from Channel 4.
What a Liberal Democrat answer that didn't quite give me a definitive yes or no. Anyway, the point of any conference speech, and this one was no exception, is to get noticed by the public and to tell your troops what way the party is going. Do you want to just set out a bit of the background of, the situation for the Lib Dems for listeners?
Right. Well, to remind ourselves, Lib Dems are the third biggest party with 72 MPs in the Commons. They elected more councillors than Labour and the Tories in the local elections in May. Yet they are on a modest 14% of the polls, which brings them in fourth. And they do complain. They have surfaced a lot in these last days that they struggle to get noticed. So like everyone else, they are trying to deal with the threat in the attention economy posed by Reform UK and the rise of Nigel Farage, and also to figure out where they stand in that old question, Sam, we'll have addressed many times at Lib Dem conferences, but now in a new climate, where do they stand vis-a-vis the Labour Party and the Tories? And today, I thought, was an attempt by Ed Davey to answer that essay question.
Yeah, we've never had it where the two main political parties feel so fragile. Right, we've got some extracts from Ed Davey's speech to come. But just to kick off, one big thought, one thing stands out from space, Anne, which is that for all the complaining that the Lib Dems do about coverage and all the complaining they do about the fact that Nigel Farage gets all of the airtime, actually Ed Davey's speech was a lot about Nigel Farage and much less about the main thing that you would think an opposition party would be campaigning about, which is the government. Yep, Ed Davey did not mention the word Keir Starmer once. He barely talked about the Labour Party at all, which I thought was a curious stance for a party that's essentially trying to make a pitch to be the government, not really to talk about that. That's the framing. That goes to the heart of the framing of what Ed Davey was trying to argue, that the next election is all about the Lib Dems versus Nigel Farage.
As every day goes by, it gets clearer. The two old parties can't deliver that change. Neither of those old parties can win back people's trust. Neither of them will win the battle of ideas for the future of our country. So it comes down to us or Nigel Farage.
Yes, Nigel Farage cropped up a lot, multiple mentions, for a party complaining, on the other hand, that the media is focused on Nigel Farage and reform. That was a bit of a paradox. I suppose, from the point of view of Ed Davey, being able to galvanise his party, saying what a lot of people who are very hostile to reform think, and who probably think the other parties going softly, was, debate point, a bigger prize than taking some lumps out of the Labour Party. That's the way I'd read that. There would have been quite a lot of thinking about that. Where did it leave him on this question of getting Tory votes? Now, this has often been said to be the incremental Daveyism. We talked about it on the podcast this morning. So I'm wondering if you've changed your mind a bit since then, since we heard so much more focus, Sam, go into bashing reform as a kind of Trumpification threat to the UK. I was more used to the Ed Davey who would go out there, for instance, target the kind of seats Jeremy Hunt for the Tories, prominent Conservative former serial cabinet minister, just about hung on to in Surrey, where the Lib Dems were second in a ferocious fight. There was one mention, I think, of Starmer as a sort of continuity Sunak. But it's quite an internal way of looking at your relations with the two parties, isn't it? You've got to be quite deep in the weeds to sort of get the point of that. So I wondered what you thought of that as the positioning.
I thought that this was very much in line with the kind of electoral strategy that we had from Ed Davey before the last election. And actually, the appeal of Ed Davey in this speech was to even more of those disaffected Tories in seats where maybe the Lib Dems came second in last year's general election. And so it was a careful, calibrated, and in some senses, cautious message when it comes to the big picture politics that he's trying to land with the electorate. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, there are a lot of people in the Liberal Democrats who would consider themselves left of centre. There are a lot of MPs here who think of themselves as social justice warriors who came into politics to make people's lives better. You know, that they would be most at home banging the drum and banging their chest for what we would think of as traditionally more left-wing causes. But if you do that, the risk is scaring the horses in the very seats that this party want to attract. So what you end up doing, what Ed Davey ends up doing, is offering a slightly muted message when it comes to the offer, and instead trying to brand the Tories as sort of edging off as a party much closer to reform, who Ed Davey says is the bogeyman of British politics, toxify the right, and then claw over, bring into his bosom those former Tory voters who just can't stomach the way that their former political home has drifted. That is the idea. The worry for some MPs is it's just not big and bold enough. They think there could be a world of winning 200 seats at the next election that involves much bolder messages of the sort that we've seen from Liberal Democrat MPs and leaders in the past. In fact, one, Christine Jardine, was quite upfront with me. This was not as left-wing a speech as we have had from previous Liberal Democrat leaders. I think that was conscious. Instead, this idea of making Nigel Farage the bogeyman, and then no doubt when it comes closer to the moment, attaching the Conservative Party closer to reform, is their way, the Liberal Democrats' way of trying to eke support. But the question is, it's just not exciting enough for some of the MPs. They think that there are bigger gains with a bolder strategy. Of course, people around Ed Davey say this is the right route and we can get a lot of seats next time around by doing exactly this.
That's intriguing because let's look at what it wasn't. It wasn't, as you say, exciting, fiery, left-wing Lib Demery, except perhaps when we talk about foreign affairs, we might see that a little bit differently. Which I basically mean Israel and the Palestinian state recognition, because the other things, they were pretty aligned, on very loyal on Ukraine to the government's position. So there's not big differences there for them to get into. But there was another great figure who stalked this speech, and that was Donald Trump. And not only was it in the context of reform is going to Trumpify Britain, but it was very much, I thought, was leaning into, if you say it wasn't exciting enough, maybe the excitement or the thrill from just thinking about this, processing it afterwards, would come from people saying, yes, I was dying for someone to say that about how much I dislike Donald Trump, and I didn't like the state visit, and I don't like all the creeping and crawling about that Keir Starmer has had to engage in to make his kind of world work with Donald Trump to a certain extent, both in the international compact, but also because of trade deals, etc. And I wonder whether that was the bit that did come across to me as visceral. Now, it's interesting that you say it's not exciting enough, but it's hard then to do that, isn't it, at the same time as saying, well, we're a very thoughtful party and we're just going to have a completely different view of the tax system, and we're going to sit in between the Tories and Labour, the old sort of triangulation or bit in the middle that they used to engage in. So I suppose you could say it veered, but I wasn't sure that I only heard this was boring incrementalism. I think what he was basically doing quite cleverly was using the fact that once you put the words Trump and Farage into things, a lot more people go like meerkats. What was that?
One of the interesting things at the next election is that for a lot of centre-left parties, and indeed to a certain extent the Tories, they are going to have to make Nigel Farage the bogeyman. So yes, in this conference season, Ed Davey got there first, but that's going to be quite crowded territory. We're going to hear a lot of that from a lot of leaders next time around because of the threat that he poses. So we will see that the point of difference for the Liberal Democrats, and Ed Davey did try to amp this up, was his unique stance on Donald Trump. Ed Davey is unashamedly, loudly opposed to the US president, didn't turn up to the state banquet last week, unlike the other political leaders. So that is a genuine point of difference. And so that's why I think you've got a lot of tying Trump and Farage. A couple of bits I'm really interested in your view on, Anne. The two bits that were designed to stand out. One was doing exactly that, talking about Trump's America, that the refrain, which he used multiple times, was, this is Trump's America, don't let it become Farage's Britain. Listen to this section where he talks about the implications on actually gun law.
Farage's Britain, where we would pay Putin for expensive fossil fuels and destroy our beautiful countryside with fracking while climate change rages on. That is Trump's America. Don't let it become Farage's Britain. Where gun laws are rolled back, so schools have to teach our children what to do in case of a mass shooting. Trump's America. Don't let it become Farage's Britain.
Now, interestingly, Ed Davey's spokesman told journalists beforehand that the quote that backs that up comes from 2014. So Nigel Farage said it 2 parties ago when he was leader, not of the Brexit Party, but of UKIP back quite a long time ago before the Brexit referendum. So quite a dated quote. The Reform Party have ridiculed Ed Davey for doing it, but clearly an attempt to just be eye-catching. But do you think that will strike a chord? Do you think that Ed Davey can summon images in parents' minds of their kids having to duck beneath desks because of Nigel Farage changing the gun laws, or is that too many leaps to actually be an effective political technique?
Well, I thought it was a stretch, and I did think it was a bit queasy. It did have a kind of doom scrolly undertone to it, because though we have many, many problems, I mean, if you've been talking about knives and violence and people being radicalized online, to young people particularly, into making terrible decisions and being harmful, you could completely follow that logic. And he did go at the tech companies and the kind of MAGA environment in that sense. I thought the guns may have been a mistake, just my personal view, because I thought it felt a little bit panicky, or was sort of sowing a panic that is not really warranted. But I think what he was doing with it was saying, imagine living in a country that gets more and more like Trump's America, right? So it's a dystopian, and there is a sort of, it's kind of a Black Mirror way of looking at politics, which is like that. I hear this quite a bit. In fairness, I do hear it from the left, and certainly the further left, as much as we heard it from Ed Davey. It's just like, 1 minute you're questioning something that's perfectly reasonable to question, and the next minute we're going to be like Serbia. It's like, I do find that that is something that is around. So Ed Davey was leaning into that with the clip and that material. Having said that, and I wonder whether we do think differently about this, so I'll pop it back to you as a question, Sam, as you heard it in the hall. Did you think, well, actually, there's maybe Lib Dems, it's a bit of a selectorate of itself, of kinds of people, bourgeois, professional generally, but like a lot of people are quite angry about what they see as the Trumpification of politics, and the main parties are a bit hamstrung about going there, because as you point out, if you've just had a state banquet, yes, you can say, I don't agree with Donald Trump, but you don't hear from Keir Starmer anything like this dystopian vision of Donald Trump. He can't do that. I mean, he would, what would happen. He would reap a whirlwind. You don't feel that Kemi Badenoch wants to do that either. Has he found a gap?
I think that Ed Davey has found a gap criticising Donald Trump I'm not sure that he can relate what's going on quite as easily to Nigel Farage. They are different characters. They are different politicians. I think that Ed Davey was also trying to do something else quite interesting. I think there's a frustration in Liberal Democrat circles that Nigel Farage isn't being challenged enough. And in a meta way, what they were doing, where they're going, we found this old quote and we're going to throw it at Nigel Farage in the way that old quotes are always being thrown at the rest of us by the media. So we thought we'd give Nigel Farage a bit of that treatment. And I think there's a sense that, they're trying to, get us to do our job better in their view. And it's in that context that there's a second bit that I want your opinion on, Anne, and that was there was an overt attack on the BBC. Now, Liberal Democrats traditionally love institutions and would be stolid defenders of the corporation. So let's just listen to that bit where he talked about the BBC, because I was quite struck by it.
And that's why it's so frustrating, so infuriating that Farage gets such an easy ride from the media. As he lies, as he divides, the BBC and others give Farage so much time and attention, but they never hold him to account for all the damage he has already done.
They singled out the BBC for basically putting Nigel Farage on telly too much. This has actually been a theme at this conference, and there was a bit of a row at a BBC dinner a couple of days ago at this conference where there was a back and forth between BBC execs and Liberal Democrat senior figures over exactly that question. But, we've touched on the paradox of talking about Nigel Farage a lot and then criticising the media for doing that. I also think that there is a big challenge in the way that the Liberal Democrats communicate. They could just do a lot better, and that would get a lot more attention. It's not that people are biased against them, it's that they've got to say punchy, eye-catching things in order to generate coverage, and that's what Nigel Farage does. There is a route to their coverage as well. But I thought it slightly odd of them to go at the corporation specifically. I invited the spokesman for the Liberal Democrats, spokesman for Ed Davey, to say if there was anyone else he was willing to criticise, sort of willing him on to say, do you mean Sky as well? And they literally declined. And so I was left thinking, what a weird passage of a speech to have.
Also odd when you think that there's just a block of opinion, left of centre, it's soft liberal, which has always defended the BBC. That hands off our BBC. It's a bit like hands off our NHS. There's a 3-letter acronym that helps define Britain. And I say this as someone who has worked a lot with the BBC. It was always a bit of a comfort zone. So the attacks tended to come from the Conservatives and from Reform. So they put themselves into an interesting horseshoe there with those attacks on the BBC. Certainly can't, I think, complain that Sky and the Sam and Anne podcast hasn't given this Liberal Democrat conference enough attention, seeing as this is the second podcast that we have made today, one featuring the Lib Dems this morning, this one solely about it. I think, again, they're leaning into something, and I can't hear it. I can hear it in the podosphere, in certain other podcasts are available, turns out. It comes a bit from the post-Brexit era when you said, these terrible people, they should never have been given so much attention in the first place, Farage. They brought us Brexit, and then you covered Brexit all wrong, and if you hadn't covered Brexit all wrong, it wouldn't have happened. I can absolutely hear the therapy version of this. This is feel free to get in touch if you think I'm wrong. I think that's where this comes from, because they don't really disagree with the BBC's values. They just don't think they're on it enough, and they think that somebody else, Nigel Farage and points around him, are getting the coverage they should have. But perhaps I, go a bit harder on that. I do think it's, as you raised it when you said something about they have to have things to say. The other thing I would say, 72 MPs. Why aren't they making more noise? If there really were noise, it's not just that you need to be on the BBC. There are other ways to communicate. Parties have to understand this. They're in a new media environment. So I would maybe say go back and have a seminar about that, with top Lib Dem troops, because it's really maybe a question why they're not cutting through. This is one occasion when maybe they did, but there's a bigger battle.
Well, I was looking across a lot of the different news channels, and Donald Trump was speaking while Ed Davey was speaking, and most of them went with the President of the United States. Right, we've got to wrap up in a moment, so just a moment for final thoughts. I suppose my big picture takeaway is, yes, there was an attack on Farage. Yes, there was an attempt to position the Liberal Democrats, not sure how credible this will be yet, as the principal opposition of Nigel Farage. But what there wasn't was a sustained argument about what the Liberal Democrats would do on the economy, what the Liberal Democrats would do on migration, and even what the Liberal Democrats would do on sort of issues of social justice that have been quite close to the heart of Lib Dem MPs down the ages. And so I'm not sure I come away from this conference having learned a huge amount. Yes, there were some policy announcements about the NHS and cancer and a reinforcement of the message around social care. But I don't think that Ed Davey gave us toe-to-toe answers on the black hole of 20 to 30 billion, for instance, that's coming down the track in a few weeks' time, or exactly the level of deterrent that they would do in order to deter migration. That's where you come away, I think, from that speech wondering, is there another gear? Is there another set of arguments that, to your point about how to generate attention, take on the biggest arguments that the other parties are making and put a liberal case, pro-liberal Democrat case, to answer those questions? I just come away thinking, isn't there more to do? Because it feels to me a bit safety first, incremental improvement in the electoral position, and just shy away from things that are going to result in too much conflict or might sort of frighten the horses. And what was your concluding thought?
I think mine went in a rather different direction. I wondered what had happened to the liberal bit of the Lib Dems, which, yes, people could mock, but look, if there was ever a time to maybe look at the sometimes overmight of the state, an era when people are having huge arguments about free speech, when things like identity cards, never mind cards, but the fact biometrics, and that the state is increasingly asking to know more and more about its citizens, that was another possible area where, you feel that liberals might be able to, or Lib Dems might be able to rediscover their more liberal vibe. I mean, I remember the days we'd go and you'd actually have quite interesting policy discussions about decriminalizing soft drugs or so, so that seemed to be missing. I think that is not really the DNA, in fairness to Ed Davey. He probably says, I don't really want to do any of those, thank you very much, Anne. But one way you can do it is say, like, we want to come with the grown-ups and be in the economic debate. I often feel that the Lib Dems are so soft in terms of their profile on the economy that maybe that is not the winning ground for them. But the relationship of the individual to the state seems to me that that's where they do have space. And then why should free speech, just become the marching banner of the right and further right, when it really is in the DNA of the Lib Dems, or at least its liberal tradition? So I wondered about that, and we're probably running out of time. But did you feel that there's a younger crowd there who are attracted to Lib Dems? Are they maybe even looking, dare we say it, beyond Ed Davey?
I think that there is a new generation of MPs wondering if this is the way that it has to be done, but it will be for them to come back and give an answer to that question in the weeks and months to come. I think on that note, as literally the tables are decoupled, the chairs are removed, and the last bit of rigging is taken out of this conference centre, we too ought to get on our skate and get back to London. I will see you tomorrow, and for Politics at Sam and Anne at the normal time. Thank you for joining us for this special debrief edition. There'll be one after every leader's speech. We will see you tomorrow.
See you in your tie, bright and early. Now the standard has been set.